Welcome to Josie to Lagos, an African podcast from Africa for Africa. Why not? We need this kind of content. The purpose of this podcast is to reflect on the African moment, to pursue an understanding of the continent and its institutions, and hopefully to answer this very important question. Why is Africa not performing to her full potential? And how can we, as young and passionate Africans, change the trajectory of the continent? Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're doing a think piece. We're going to do what they call in the universities conceptual analysis. Conceptual analysis consists primarily in breaking down or analyzing concepts into their constituent parts in order to gain knowledge or a better understanding of a particular philosophical issue in which the concept is involved. The primary reason for using conceptual analysis is to understand the meaning of an idea or concept. The secondary reason is to determine how that idea or concept relates to other philosophical problems. So today we're doing a think piece on what it means to be an African. What makes us African? What is an African? Is this a real and worthwhile label to even pursue? It sounds simple as a question, but I think we often don't reflect enough about our identity and what that means for the moment and what that means for our future. Does my African identity create obligations? If so, what are those obligations? Can I opt out of my African identity? Is Drake an African? I mean, if you think about it, he has an African American dad, he has a Jewish mom, and by virtue of having an African American dad, he could claim to be African if he so chose, but he doesn't. What about Barack Obama? Is he an African? His dad is from Kenya, his mom is American, he was born in America, unlike what Donald Trump would have us believe. But what is he? You know, in the African tradition, we would consider what your father is as what you are. But obviously, Barack Obama identifies first as an African and not necessarily first as an American and not necessarily first as an African. What about Elon Musk? He doesn't seem to identify anymore as South African. He seems to be an American now, an American billionaire, but he's a South African man. Is he an African? What about Mo Salah, the football player? What does it mean to be African? Is it about being from Africa? Is it about being for Africa? Or is it about being with Africa? Let me repeat that. Is it about being from Africa, for Africa, or with Africa? What's the value of reflecting anyway? Why have this think piece? Why go through this process? Often in our African discussions and conversations, we debate the leaders of Africa, the old men, the incompetent people, the corrupt people, and all of the personalities and drama across the continent. We debate the influence of the West on Africa. We debate the United Kingdom, France, America, Russia. But do we think enough about what it means to be African in 2020? What it will mean in 2050? Sometimes this negligence or this comfort with not examining our African identity comes from the fact that we don't necessarily have to do it. I mean, if you are comfortably in the in-group, you don't necessarily have to do the work of reflecting on what the meaning of that group is. It's often the people who are on the borderline of an identity, the mixed race people, the mixed nationalities, the mixed location, the new entrant into a particular community. Those are the people that get oftentimes to do the reflective work. You'll find that mixed race people will write a lot of literature on blackness because they are grappling with it. They're grappling with the dual identities. But I think that the work is valuable for them to do, but it's also valuable for us to do. Even if we're brown as the sands of Africa, even if we've never left Africa to go anywhere, I think we should also think about what does it mean to be African? I think we too need to fully understand what it means to be part of a collective identity. And in so doing, I think that will help us understand ourselves and how to interact with that specific identity. You may be asking, or you may have the view that identity is just a social construct and you are an individual and you don't subscribe to identity. And I want to respond to that. But before I do, let me define a social construct. A social construct is something that exists not in objective reality like a table or a river, but as a result of human interaction. It exists because humans agree that it exists. Some examples of social constructs would include gender, race, nationality. Interestingly enough, in Africa, we've had less agency with the final determination of this concept of nationhood. What makes Nigeria, Nigeria, South Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Zambia. We have national identities that are the product of the Berlin Conference of 1884. At that conference, that's when the partitioning of Africa occurred and the period of history known as the scramble for Africa occurred. So you had countries like France and Belgium and the United Kingdom participate in just dividing Africa up based on their interests. So what that means is that some of the identities that we identify with, we also need to re-examine. And those identities are also social constructs. While social constructs are not real, they are fictions. They can have value. If you look at the unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck, the Germanic people were a variety of tribes and they were not united before Otto von Bismarck actually took a series of actions to create the nation that we know now as Germany. The queer community, they have also created an identity and advocated for rights under that identity, and they've been able to secure wins and victories and protections under that identity. Even if you were to consider great nations such as China, it's no secret that there are multiple ethnicities and sub-identities underneath being Chinese, but the Chinese have been able to create a collective identity and use that collective identity as a nation state to acquire benefits in the world. So even though African identity is a social construct, this episode is asking you to think, what is the optimum ground for that construct to occupy? A core question could be, is this a valuable or a realistic construct to even pursue? Let's look at some definitions to try to place our finger on this concept. We'll start off with the generic English definition from the dictionary. We'll look at an artist definition, and then we'll have a discussion. The English dictionary offers 3 definitions. One is an adjective. So the adjective is African, relating to Africa or its people, customs, or languages. An example that's given is, the men, all of North African descent, were dressed casually and appeared in the dock with 2 interpreters. There's the noun definition, which is a person from Africa. The example that's given in this dictionary I'm looking at is, meanwhile, more black African slaves were owned by black Africans than white Americans. It's actually a problematic example because anyway, you get the picture. It's a person from Africa. The other noun is a person of black African descent. So here the example that's given is, many of the names belong to the people of Arabic, African, or Asian descent. Basically what I've bee doing is doing that spelling bee thing where you use it in a sentence. So that last definition, a person of black African descent, is a definition that is contested in some parts of Africa, the parts of Africa with large multiracial populations. In South Africa, some people would reject a contemporary definition of African as being contingent on descent or race in any capacity. They would say Natasha Mazone, a member of parliament in South Africa, is as much an African as Julius Malema. They would say that Mohamed Salah is also an African as much as Didier Drogba and Burna Boy are. They would say that race should not be the basis of Africanness. And the question we're going to explore a little bit towards the end of the episode is, are they right when they say this? Let's look at an artist definition. The Jamaican artist Peter Tosh has a song on this very topic, and he provides a definition according to him of what it means to be an African. If you're not familiar with Peter Tosh was a Jamaican reggae musician who made a lot of music with Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer. And he was actually one of the core members of the band The Wailers from 1963 to 1976, after which he established himself as a successful solo artist and a promoter of Rastafari. So if you know Bob Marley and The Wailers, you'd know Peter Tosh because he was part of The Wailers. But he had his own independent career as a solo artist, and in one of those songs that he made, he spoke about what it means to be an African. And in his definition, he was dealing with some of the exclusions that were coming from Africa around what it meant to be African. So in his song, he rejects location as part of the definition. He says, I don't know where you come from. As long as you're a black man, you are an African. No mind your nationality. You've got the identity of an African. Because if you come from Trinidad, you're an African. And if you come from Nassau, you're an African. And if you come from Cuba, you're an African. So obviously I'm not a singer, but I'm trying to give you the rhythm. He rejects complexion as a descriptor for Africanness. He says, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. No mind your complexion. There's no rejection. You're an African. Because if your plexion high, high. And if your plexion low, low. And if your plexion in between. And plexion here is complexion, of course. So he says, listen, it doesn't matter whether you've got a high, a low, in between, you're an African. He also rejects religion as a metric for measuring Africanness. He says, if you go to the Catholic Church, you are an African. And if you go to the Methodist Church, you are an African. And if you go to the Church of Gods, you're an African. But Peter Tosh has one qualifier that he maintains. He says, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. And you got to think about that and think, is that acceptable? Is he right? Is he right? We'll look at that a little bit later. What about the issues which you could think about in terms of the African identity? Theoretically, the whole global community is African because all of humanity comes from African. So at what point do you draw the line between being a descendant from Africa and being a contemporary descendant from Africa who can call themselves an African? What about the complex cases? You know, we often discuss African identity only in the context of what I would just call the de facto African. You're born in Africa, you live in Africa all your life, all your paperwork is African. Easy peasy, no problem. But then there's the de jure Africans, the Africans who are legally here, but may not even have been born here, may have African identity by way of, an identification document, but maybe they are also Chinese, they are also European, whatever the case may be. What happens to people who have been here for generations and generations, who no longer have a European or a Western home and now call Africa their home? Can they too label themselves and claim the identity of an African, even though technically they are not of African descent? What happens in those kind of cases? What happens in the instances of dual commitments, where you are a Scottish citizen and you're also an African passport holder? If you think of the American Nigerian rapper Jidena, he's an American, he's a Nigerian. Which one is he? Which one can he be? Can he be both? Where do you draw the line? If you think of a person like Nick Mangwana, Nick Mangwana is the Secretary of Information in Zimbabwe, but he holds a passport from the United Kingdom, and he's also acting as a government official in Zimbabwe, but he's a European citizen, or rather a citizen of the United Kingdom. So in that instance, how do you measure? How do you ascertain? And how do you ascertain when the factors get more multifactorial than simply a case of Nick Mangwana or Jidena, where it's maybe more clear? You're like, well, he's Nigerian, so he's African, or he's Zimbabwean, so he's African. What happens in the case where I am from Scotland with Botswana citizenship and South African citizenship, and I'm living in America? Am I an African? What makes one African? Some have said that the pursuit of African identity is not even worth doing because it's not a viable social construct. They say this is romantic, and if you look at the reality of Africa, There are so many challenges which actually exist that Black people should not seek a monolithic identity or claim to have a monolithic identity. They'll point out that there are 1.3 billion people and counting who live in Africa, that there are so many languages in Africa, so many cultures, so many ethnicities. And as a result of that, can it legitimately be said that there is a common African identity in any shape or form? If you were to consider that argument, it does seem persuasive. And they would even say, look, I reject collectivism and I view myself as an individual. So even though I have this same genetic code or a similar genetic code and similar experiences, I do not consider myself to be part of Africa and to be part of the African project. And I do not think anyone should as well. Can they be a common African identity? I think I've been asking a lot of questions, but this is where I'm going to make my first submission. I think that the answer is yes. I think that Africans have the basis for a common African identity, even in light of the multiplicity of languages, cultures, and also just differences in terms of worldview, because there are some common threads that hold Africans together. There is a value system called Ubuntu. It expresses itself in different manifestations across the regions, but basically it speaks of how an African identifies themselves through the contributions and the relationships that they make with the community. Ubuntu is a philosophy field of thought that exists and is studied by academics at universities across the world, and is an interesting concept. And those academics have confirmed that this is a distinct philosophical concept and one which is commonly found across African spaces, regardless of their location. The value system is similar. So if there is a similar value system, if you look at the concept of Ujamaa, which is popular in East Africa, but finds its expression across the continent in various forms, that is a reflection to me that there is indeed a commonality of values which reaches a critical threshold to allow for Africans to actually say, hey, we have a common value system. Even the way that Africans interact with family is oftentimes different to the European interaction. While it may be true that the Asian communities and many communities in the Middle East also still centralize and put at a primary level the family, the extended family, and obligations to it, if you were to look at the African expression of those obligations, commitments, you would find that they are indeed distinct and differentiated. So that proves to me, or makes an argument that I would submit to you, that there is enough ground of sufficiency for Africans to say we have a common enough value system. But beyond the common value system, there's also a common oppression. There has been a common historic oppression of Africans from the time of slavery, colonialism, extending into the independent period where Africans were confronting neocolonialism. So I think that even if you were to look at the experiences of the African diaspora and African migrants and African descendants of slaves who are living in the West or even in the East, you will find that they still face oppression in the context of racial discrimination, racial profiling, racial exclusion, economic marginalization. What this means is that the global community does have a common perception of what an African identity is. And even if they don't, we as Africans have a common shared experience for hundreds of years that binds us together because we have to collectively fight that experience. It does not differentiate between each of the Africans or each of the characters that we have discussed thus far. Even more pragmatically, African countries have a pragmatic reason to pursue a common identity. So let's assume that though people who say identity is a social construct and you should not even pursue it and it's of no value, let's assume those people are correct. It would still be of worth for Africans to deliberately create their own identity under the label of African, to be able to attain global relevance. The reason why I'm saying this is because African countries cannot prosper in isolation. The dynamics of the world are such that African states are impoverished, they're incapacitated, they suffer from maladministration, mismanagement, they suffer from misappropriation, miseducation of populations, and as a result of that, they're at a back foot in a world that is moving towards more robotics, deep learning, artificial learning, 4IR. In that context, you can only survive within a collective. Look at some examples which are not necessarily around the concept of Africa. Hip hop came together as a community, the people who were making hip hop. They came together as a community to create a product and a culture to export to the world. Kickstarter and GoFundMe were corporate Silicon Valley interventions which were based on the pooling of resources on an African model, crowdfunding, and all of this traffic that is pooled traffic, Uber and all of these companies, they're actually based on African sharing systems. In fact, the company that preceded Uber is Lyft, and the founder of Lyft spent some time in Zimbabwe and was looking at the collective transport system that existed there and thought to himself, if I add some technology to this, I will really disrupt global transport. So even if you look at Lyft and Uber, those companies are a result of the African perspective. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's another entity coming in, observing African systems and finding ways to make them work for themselves. Africans should do the same. They should also look at their systems and try to create an identity that allows them to be able to maximize the benefit within the global community. So even if it's difficult, and even if there are obstacles on the way, I would submit that the only pragmatic way for Africans to prosper is for them to deliberately pursue that collective identity. So the people who say there's no one monolithic Black identity, there's no one monolithic African identity, I would say even if that's true, we still want to pursue and work towards it, because only under that identity can Africans truly prosper. But what about the individual? Does the individual get extinguished in this particular process? I would give you Ethiopia as a case study and say no. Ethiopia is a good example of how you can sustain a multiplicity of ethnicities and still be able to maintain one common identity, which is a meta identity. There are over 80 ethnic tribes in Ethiopia. The population of Ethiopia is 110 million people. It is a large country with a large number of ethnicities. They have been able, however, to craft an identity which is based on their diversity, but creates a common identity. They are able to celebrate their varying tribal customs, cuisines, norms, traditions, value systems, and still be able to remain under the banner of Ethiopian. It's not a perfect system, and they are currently dealing with a lot of challenges which are coming from tribal conflicts and the attempts of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to create a more pan-Ethiopian identity. Some people are not fully buying into that. They believe more in the tribe than they do in the collective of Ethiopia. Having said that, however, it's important to recognize that the Ethiopian project is one that has largely remained successful and able to navigate the distinctions between the individual and the collective. So you can have both. And in some instances in Africa, the people fighting for resources are not really doing so from a genuine perspective. They're not trying to preserve their African identity or their tribal identity because they value it. They're trying to do that simply because they benefit from that identity existing as distinct from the others, because they are in the elite group and they are necessarily the ones controlling resources or that kind of thing. But even in spite of the imperfections of Ethiopia, I would say to you that it is an interesting case study to show that you can have your individual diversity and identity while still being part of a collective identity. So here are my final thoughts on who's African. I'm going to give you my view on who's African, try to answer these questions. So I'm not here talking about the paperwork, the legal paperwork. I think that's not really the main thrust of an African identity conversation. Because even if you think about it from a soccer perspective, I could buy a Liverpool Football Club membership or ticket or whatever it is that they use to identify Liverpool members. But the reality is that I'm Manchester United till I die. I will never. The reason I say that is just to show that this cannot really be about paperwork or the legalistic interpretations of being African. So I will submit to you that these are the people who can claim or ought to be able to claim with full credentials, aside from the paperwork stuff, to be African. So if you can claim it by descent, sure, you're an African, you're in. If you are willing to earn the title of being African, I think that you should also be in, because you're working towards, being a real part of the fabric. So I think that kind of a person, we can definitely say this is an African, because they're working, they're doing the work, they're learning the cultures, the customs, the norms, and just even operating in the spect with respect. That is somebody who I think can appropriate an African identity to themselves, or rather can inculcate, appropriate is not the right word, inculcate African identity for themselves. So for me, it's not about race. It's not even about the customs and the traditions, but it's really about a willingness and an openness to be part of the African project. Who is not an African? I would say that anyone who works to oppress or regress Africa should not be able to claim themselves as an African, whether they have the descent or they don't have the descent. I think that you disqualify yourself from the label when you act in ways that undercut Africa. So all these so-called African leaders who have acted in ways where they have sold African resources and exploited the people and put the people back. I think the people who made it worse for Africans whilst claiming to be African leaders were not anywhere close to being African leaders. It's not even that they were sellouts, which is a commonly used political phrase. I think that really they abdicated the moment that they became people who were working against African progress. So that includes a lot of these dictators, even some of the ones that you may like. I think that the person who acts in ways that oppress or regress Africa is disqualified. What are the obligations of an African? I would submit that every African has an obligation to learn and understand the continent, how it works, how it operates. I would say that they have an obligation to work towards the common goals of the continent, which are integration, which are collaboration, cooperation, which are celebration and preservation of culture. I think that if you are committed to those things, I think that you ought to be committed to those things and you ought to work towards those things. What about globalization? I think that unless we have a common African identity, unless we have been able to get our house in order, we will not be secure in a globalized world. Globalization will yield and has not yielded any benefits to a divided Africa. What about seeing humanity and not seeing color and not seeing race? I think in the first instance, it's almost the way that Stephen Covey argues in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Before you are interdependent, you have to be independent. And in order to be independent, you have to know who you are. And in order for you to know who you are, you have to examine your identity, your vision for yourself, your goals. You have to articulate who you want to be and what you want to become. And the more you understand the self, the better able you are to give the self to others in collaborative projects. So I think that to ask an African to not see themselves as an African first and immediately skip to seeing themselves as a globalist or a humanitarian undercuts their development, which is necessary for them to be able to be on that stage with the full agency. I think Africans need to really reflect and come to terms, not at a de facto level, not at a just, well, I'm here and this is my space and this is the music I listen to, but really at a philosophical and deliberate level before they can really transcend to making points and arguments that they are humanitarians. You can still be a humanitarian. What I'm submitting is that I do think it's preferable to understand self first before you try to aspire to a higher level of global participation. You may ask, what about African identity clashing with local identity? How should one respond, and how does that work in Jamie's worldview? I would say that you have to choose the local first, where the African is trying to erase your local identity. I don't think that the African agenda and the Pan-African worldview should be such that it erases your Africanness. I think that you must always try to remain Zulu, remain Venda, remain Shona, remain Maasai, to remain Mende as much as possible, without that being erased by African identity. So I'm not sure how it would work in a real world scenario, but in any space where the African identity assumes or tries to erase your local identity, I think you opt for the local first. But I think that where the local is trying to derail and erase the continental, that's a space where you have to choose the regional and the African level, because sometimes actors across the continent act in ways to torpedo the African project, to keep Africans in shackles, oppressed and repressed. And in those instances, I think that it's important for one to be able to say, this is actually not in line with my goals as an African, and as a result I have to oppose my local, because my local is rejecting the international, and the international in this case is the only way that I get to be able to effectively fight China, America, the EU, or whoever else in the economic game, in the history game, in the game of human development and progress. So I would also say that as much as you have a local identity and a regional identity, your local identity must, I guess, be in line with the continental values and the global values. Your African identity cannot and should not be used to sustain oppression and oppressive practices in the name of tradition, in the name of custom. I think that the reflective Pan-African has to think forward and try to construct ways to be African, which is in line with values which respect, equality, which respect freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of movement, freedom of association. I think that you find ways to manifest your African identity on a common value system, which we all agree is one that does protect the individual from abuse. So to close off this episode, I want to challenge you and ask you, what do you understand about being African? What do you think about being African? And do you think that being African is worth pursuing? Thanks so much for making it to the end of the episode. You're a champion. I hope it was valuable and useful to you. Apologies for the absence last week. We took a break. We had some issues with power, but we're back. Everything is in order, and we will continue to provide weekly episodes. So if you enjoyed this episode, let us know via comments, interact with us on all of the platforms. Till we meet again, stay safe, stay healthy, stay vigilant, and may you prosper in all that you do.